The morning of December 18, 1944, outside the Belgian village of Kringelt, was colder than most. Frost clung to the metal of the 88mm Pak 43 anti-tank gun as Oberfeld Rebel Klaus Richter adjusted his position. The crew had been awake since 3 a.m., part of the massive German counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. They had all been through hell on the Eastern Front, but nothing had prepared them for what was about to unfold. Klaus was 26, a seasoned veteran who had already destroyed 11 Soviet tanks at Kursk. To him and his crew, the 88 was more than a weapon, it was a certainty, a guarantee of victory. For 2 years, they had watched it tear through enemy armor, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. This gun had been their shield and sword, an unchallenged symbol of German power. The crew stood huddled against the cold, their breaths fogging the air. The silence of the forest was broken only by the rhythmic whir of the traverse wheel, as the gunner, Greiter Hunts Muller, slowly swung the barrel into position. Klaus nodded silently. They had done this so many times before that words were unnecessary. Greiter's hand slammed a 22-pound armor-piercing shell into the breech with practiced ease. Within seconds, the gun was ready, and the tension in the air was palpable. They were positioned perfectly 300 meters down the road, the perfect range for the 88mm. The enemy was coming. Through the early morning fog, a movement caught Klaus' eye. A Sherman tank, the unmistakable silhouette of American armor emerging from the trees. He felt a wave of satisfaction. Another Sherman to destroy. His men had destroyed hundreds, maybe thousands of these tin cans, these Tommy cookers, as they had come to call them. Klaus wasn't worried. The 88 had never failed him before. Not once. He locked eyes with Greiter. "Fire!" Klaus ordered, his voice steady. The massive cannon roared to life. The concussive blast rattled the equipment, and the ground trembled beneath them. The shell raced through the air, crossing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. A flash of bright sparks illuminated the scene as the shell struck the Sherman's hull just below the turret. But something was wrong. Instead of piercing the thick armor and turning the crew inside to rubble, the shell bounced. It deflected upward, spiraling into the gray sky. The crew stood frozen. A moment of silence. No one spoke. No one could. The roar of the gun had barely faded before Klaus, Greiter, and the others exchanged confused glances. Had they misjudged the range? The angle? Their training had been flawless, 300 meters, right in the heart of the enemy's weakest spot. It should have been a textbook shot. But the Sherman kept coming. The engine hummed as if nothing had happened. Klaus blinked, trying to make sense of the impossible. He had destroyed tanks from twice that distance, but this one didn't even flinch. His mind raced. But before he could grasp the enormity of the situation, he barked, "Reload! Now!" The loader moved swiftly, almost mechanically, his hands working as though they had practiced the motions 1,000 times. The breech slammed shut. The next round was ready. Greiter fired again. The shot was dead on, hitting the Sherman square in the center of the turret. Another flash. Another bounce. The spark of impact flared in the cold morning air. And once again, the shell ricocheted off the thick steel plating like a stone skipping across water. The crew stood frozen in disbelief. What kind of tank was this? Klaus felt the ground shift beneath him. His mind, usually sharp and quick, felt sluggish as the impossible unfolded before his eyes. The Sherman kept coming. It was as if they weren't even there. As if their weapon, their one unshakable advantage, had lost its power. The 88mm gun, the symbol of German might, had just failed them. It wasn't just the tank that was unkillable. It was the psychological blow that came with it. In that moment, Klaus felt something shift inside him. His confidence, the very bedrock of his identity, shattered. What was this tank? The Americans had never been able to match the might of the German war machine. But here, now, on the cold ground of Kringelt, they had. He felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. Was this a new kind of weapon? Something even the vaunted 88mm couldn't handle? The Sherman continued its march forward, unwavering. The tank's turret began to slowly rotate toward them, its sights locked on the German position. Klaus didn't know what to do. His mind was blank, and for the first time in his career, he felt a rising fear that had nothing to do with the front lines. This wasn't just a tank. This was something that had changed the rules, and they hadn't been prepared. His crew, usually so sure of themselves, now stood silent, each one grappling with the same unsettling realization. The gun that had once been the harbinger of death was now powerless. They had encountered something new, something their training, their experience, and their weapon could not defeat. The moment of certainty was gone. The war had just changed in a way they couldn't yet understand. And as Klaus watched the Sherman's turret swing toward him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger was at play, something that would forever shift the balance of the war. The certainty of victory that had fueled them for so long had just been destroyed in an instant. And the man who had always been so sure of his victory now stood at the edge of the unknown. Klaus Richter and his crew sat frozen in disbelief. A tank appeared that should never have existed. It was a mere shadow on the horizon at first, the low rumble of its engine barely heard over the wind. But as it drew closer, the sheer weight of its presence was undeniable. This was not just another Sherman tank, it was something more, something that the Germans had never expected, never prepared for, and certainly never understood. The M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, a stopgap solution, born not from careful design, but out of desperation. The Allies were gearing up for the D-Day invasion, and their tanks, especially the M4 Sherman, were proving inadequate against the increasingly formidable German defenses. While the Sherman was reliable, it was also vulnerable. Its armor, though sufficient early in the war, had become a liability against the superior firepower of German tanks like the Panther and Tiger. American tankers were well aware of the limitations. A hit from a German 88mm gun could tear through the Sherman's thin armor like paper, often leaving the crew with little chance of survival. But in the heart of the Allied war effort, amid the rising desperation of the war's middle stages, the solution wasn't elegant. It was brute force. The M4A3E2 was born out of necessity, the result of engineers scrambling to address the armor vulnerability of their tanks without the luxury of time. The goal was simple: reinforce the Sherman as much as possible without a complete redesign. It was a hasty decision, driven by mounting casualties and the growing realization that the Allies had to contend with the German heavy tanks in the coming battles. The solution was crude but effective. The engineers at Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan took the standard Sherman chassis and added as much armor as it could physically bear. Extra steel plates were welded onto the hull, thickened with applique armor. The glassy plate, the tank's front armor, was reinforced with an additional 1.5 inches of hardened steel, bringing its total thickness to an impressive 5.5 inches. The turret received a similar treatment, with its frontal casting increased to 7 inches of solid steel. Even the tracks, usually vulnerable to anti-tank fire, were shielded by protective skirts to fend off hollow charge weapons. At 42 tons, the Jumbo was a behemoth, an armor-plated monster designed to absorb hits and keep moving forward, no matter the cost. But with such a design came compromises. The added weight slowed the tank down significantly, reducing its top speed to a sluggish 22 miles per hour, a far cry from the more nimble standard Shermans. It became a tank built for survival, not for speed or maneuverability. The 75mm gun, while still effective against infantry and lighter targets, was hardly a match for the German heavy tanks it would now face. The Jumbo was never intended to engage these beasts head-on in terms of firepower. It was designed to lead the charge, to absorb the punishment that would otherwise destroy standard Shermans, and to create breaches in enemy lines. Secrecy surrounded the project. The Americans, aware of how vital this new tank could be, were careful not to let their enemies know what they had produced. Only 254 of the M4A3E2s were ever built. These tanks were sent to the front in small numbers, scattered across multiple armored divisions, making it nearly impossible for the Germans to identify them as a new and formidable threat. The Jumbos didn't appear in overwhelming numbers, and because of their outward similarity to standard Shermans, they were often dismissed as anomalies. By the time the Germans encountered the first Jumbos, They had no reason to believe they were facing anything other than another version of the Sherman. German intelligence, stretched thin across multiple fronts and crippled by constant bombardment, was woefully unaware of the new tank. No formal reconnaissance missions had spotted the jumbos in any significant way, and the few reports that did mention them were written off as mistaken sightings of regular Shermans. To make matters worse, the Germans had long assumed that American tanks were simply not a threat in terms of armor. The Americans' focus on quantity over quality had worked in their favor early in the war, but the reality was clear to anyone on the front lines. The Germans had the superior tanks, the superior anti-tank guns, and the psychological advantage. But that day, outside Kringelt, that assumption would be shattered. The 88mm PaK-43 gun that had long been the terror of Allied tank crews could not penetrate the Sherman's reinforced armor. The Germans, who had relied on the confidence of their weapon for years, were forced to confront an enemy they hadn't prepared for. An enemy that seemed impervious to their best efforts. The Jumbo Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of the American industrial power and ingenuity that had quietly changed the course of the war. By the time the Germans recognized what they were up against, it was too late. The tank that shouldn't have existed had already arrived, and it was about to make its mark on the battlefield in ways that German doctrine could never have predicted. While American tankers climbed into their Shermans knowing they were vulnerable, the Jumbo would turn that vulnerability into invulnerability, becoming a symbol of what American industry could achieve. The M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman, though not the fastest or most heavily armed tank on the battlefield, was built with one singular purpose: to survive. Designed as a response to the ever-growing threat posed by German heavy armor, the Jumbo was an answer born out of desperation, but it would soon become a force to be reckoned with. The M4A3E2 wasn't a radical departure from the standard Sherman. It was an evolution, a tank designed not for speed or firepower, but for endurance. Every inch of the tank was reinforced with additional armor, transforming the Sherman from a relatively nimble workhorse into a heavily armored beast. The glassy plate, one of the tank's most critical parts, was bolstered with an extra 1.5 inches of hardened steel, giving the front of the tank an effective thickness of 5.5 inches. The turret, already formidable on standard Shermans, was made even thicker, with 7 inches of steel added to the front. Even the tracks were shielded by armored skirts, protecting the suspension from anti-tank weapons designed to cripple the tank from the sides. The extra weight made the Jumbo sluggish, reducing its top speed to just 22 miles per hour. A far cry from the 30 miles per hour the standard M4 could reach. The Jumbo's slow pace was a clear disadvantage, could no longer outmaneuver enemy forces. Its turning radius was wide, its acceleration slow, and its ability to climb steep terrain severely hampered. But none of that mattered when compared to the one crucial element: survival. The Jumbo's added armor made it nearly impossible to defeat head-on, a mobile fortress designed to absorb the incoming punishment of battle. Inside, the crew felt the burden of the tank's mass. The cramped interior was even more crowded than a standard Sherman, with the added weight limiting the tank's mobility. The crew had to adjust to the lack of speed, learning how to compensate for the sluggishness while still making the most of their firepower. The Jumbo was never designed to outgun or outpace its enemies. It was designed to absorb hits and keep going. It was a psychological advantage as much as a physical one. When a Jumbo Sherman rolled onto the battlefield, its very presence changed the way enemy gunners approached the fight. For the crew, there was no room for mistakes. The tank was not fast enough to avoid incoming fire, and its size made it an easy target. But it was also a tank that could take more than it gave, with its reinforced armor turning what should have been a fatal shot into little more than a nuisance. This was a tank that could withstand the worst the Germans could throw at it, and that, in itself, was a victory. The crew would learn to rely on their armor, for it was the one thing they could count on in a world of uncertainty. When the Germans fired their first shots at the Jumbo, they did so with all the confidence in the world, only to have that confidence crash down as their shells ricocheted off the beast they couldn't understand. The scene outside Kringelt that cold December morning was one that no one would forget, least of all the German gunners manning the 88mm PaK-43. They had trained for this moment. They had faced countless Shermans, each one a target waiting to be destroyed by the deadly fire of their anti-tank guns. They knew their weapons could rip through the American tanks without hesitation. The 88mm was the most feared anti-tank weapon of the war, a gun that had obliterated everything from Soviet T-34s to British Churchills with ruthless efficiency. But this time it was different. The Jumbo Sherman rolled into view, its massive form barely visible through the fog. For the German crew, it looked like any other Sherman. They had destroyed thousands of them, and this one, despite its size, didn't seem like anything special at first glance. But as the German gunner, Hans Mahler, adjusted his sights and fired, something happened that no one could have anticipated. The shell hit the Sherman squarely in the front. The familiar flash of impact, usually a sign of a successful hit, was followed by a deafening silence. And then, a spark. The shell bounced off the Sherman's armor as if it had struck stone. No explosión, no penetración. Just a violent deflection, sending the shell ricocheting harmlessly into the air. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with confusion, as if the crew could not comprehend what had just happened. Greider blinked through his optics, his mind racing. Had they misjudged the range? Had they misfired? No, the data was correct, 300 meters, a textbook shot. The Sherman should have been a heap of scrap metal by now. But it wasn't. Klaus Richter, the crew commander, was the first to break the silence. His voice, usually steady and commanding, faltered as he ordered, "Reload! Fire again!" His words were mechanical, his mind still reeling from the impossible. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew the 88mm had never failed him before, couldn't fail him now. The loader slammed another armor-piercing round into the breech, and the crew braced themselves. They had done this 1,000 times, and the routine was almost a comfort. But as the shell fired once more, there was no comfort to be found. The second shot hit the Sherman directly in the turret. Again, the flash of impact. Again, the deflection. The crew stared in disbelief. This was no ordinary Sherman. Klaus' mind raced. What was this? What had they encountered? This tank was supposed to crumble under the weight of the 88mm gun. But it wasn't. Couldn't. The German gunners had faced countless tanks. But this was different. This was something that shouldn't exist. It was a tank that shrugged off their most powerful weapon, and with each failed shot, their understanding of the war, their understanding of their own superiority, began to crumble. In the space of just seconds, their once unshakable confidence had been shattered. The 88mm PaK-43, the weapon that had defined their dominance, had just failed them. And the worst part was that they didn't know why. As the Sherman's turret slowly began to rotate towards them, the crew was left to grapple with a realization that would haunt them for the rest of the war. They were no longer facing a war of certainty. They were facing the unknown. For 3 years, the 88mm gun had been the ultimate weapon. The weapon that had torn through Soviet T-34s, British Churchills, and American Shermans with deadly precision. But now, as German gunners fired at the Jumbo and saw their shells bounce off, the very foundation of their certainty began to crack. Klaus Richter could feel it in the air. The unspoken confusion, the disbelief that spread through his crew like a disease. The 88mm had been their answer to everything. It was the weapon that had given them a sense of control, a psychological edge over their enemies. The Americans were inferior. Their tanks were paper-thin, easy to destroy. That was the truth they had always known. But now, as their shots failed to penetrate the Jumbo, that truth was being tested. And it was crumbling. Hans Mahler, who had always been so confident, now found himself questioning every shot. Was it the angle, the range, the ammunition? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. This tank was something else entirely. The very idea that they could encounter a tank like this, one that could take direct hits and still keep coming, was beyond their comprehension. It made no sense. The 88mm was the most powerful anti-tank gun in the world. It had never failed them before. How could it fail now? As the tank rolled forward, invulnerable to their best efforts, the German gunners began to feel a creeping sense of dread. The psychological shift was subtle at first, like the faintest crack in the armor of their confidence. But as more rounds bounced off the Jumbo, the realization set in. They were no longer facing an enemy they understood. The war had changed. It was no longer just about firepower. It was about something deeper. The Americans had created something far more powerful than they had expected. Something that shattered the certainty of the battlefield. The foundation of German superiority was no longer secure. The 88mm had failed, and in that failure, the Germans began to question everything they thought they knew about the war. How could this happen? What were they up against? The creeping doubt transformed their once unshakable confidence into something fragile. The psychological dominance they had held for so long was slipping away. The shift wasn't just about one tank. It was about the psychological war that was now being waged on both sides. The Germans had long believed they held the upper hand, but now, with each deflected shot, they were faced with the uncomfortable truth. Their enemy had learned to fight back, and they had created something that could take everything they threw at it and keep fighting. While the Germans questioned their tactics, American tankers found new strength in the Jumbo. It wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of resilience and hope in the heart of a brutal conflict. For the American tankers, the arrival of the Jumbo was a revelation. They had long known the vulnerability of their standard Shermans, and the war had been a constant battle of survival. The Sherman was reliable, but its armor was weak. When it faced the German heavy tanks, it often felt like a death sentence, a game of chance where luck determined whether you would survive. But now, with the Jumbo, that uncertainty is gone. They had a tank that could take on the Germans head-to-head and still come out on top. It was no longer about hoping for a lucky shot or finding a way around the German guns. With the Jumbo, American tankers stood tall, knowing they could take the fight directly to the enemy. The role of the Jumbo in the Battle of the Bulge was pivotal. In the harsh winter conditions, as German forces launched their final desperate counteroffensive, the Jumbos became the vanguard of the American assault. They led the way, pushing forward where standard Shermans would have faltered. Their reinforced armor allowed them to take the brunt of the German fire, while the smaller, more vulnerable tanks could maneuver into better positions. The Jumbo became not just a tank but a morale booster, a rallying point for American troops who had grown weary of the brutal fighting. For the American crews, the psychological impact was just as important as the physical one. No longer did they have to rely on luck or evasion. The Jumbo gave them the confidence to stand their ground, to push forward even when faced with overwhelming odds. The Germans may have had superior firepower, but the American tankers now had something far more valuable. The belief that they could win, that they could survive, and that they could take the fight to the heart of the enemy. As the battle raged on, the Jumbo proved its worth, holding positions where the regular Shermans would have been overrun. Its slow speed was no longer a disadvantage. It became a strength. The Germans had relied on their ability to outmaneuver and overwhelm the Americans, but the Jumbo didn't move quickly. It simply didn't need to. It could take hit after hit, and when the time came, it could strike back, forcing the Germans to rethink their entire strategy. The American crew's confidence soared. They no longer had to fear the German 88mm guns, and they knew that if they held the line long enough, reinforcements would come. The Jumbo had changed the game. It wasn't just a tank. It was the embodiment of American resilience and industrial might. As long as they had these machines on the battlefield, the Americans knew they had a fighting chance. The war was far from over, but for the first time in years, the American tankers stood on equal footing with their German counterparts, and that was a victory in itself. As American tanks pushed forward, the Germans continued to believe that their 88mm gun could take out anything in its path, until the truth hit them. There was something they hadn't been prepared for. The Germans, for all their strategic brilliance, had failed to see the significance of the new tank that was causing havoc on the battlefield. The Jumbo Sherman, a tank designed for survival rather than speed or firepower, had become an enemy the Germans could not defeat with their usual tactics. The failure of German intelligence to recognize the Jumbo's importance was a critical mistake, and one that would haunt them for the rest of the war. The Germans were already stretched thin on all fronts. Their military had been battered by years of warfare, and their intelligence networks, once robust and efficient, were faltering. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft, once able to spot new enemy units from miles away, were being shot out of the skies by Allied air superiority. Their spies, too, were being captured or turned by the Allies, and the internal sabotage operations by Allied double agents were taking their toll. By late 1944, the Germans could no longer rely on the detailed, timely intelligence that had once been their strength. Worse still, the German military was bogged down by misinformation. There were reports of new American tank variants circulating, but the details were vague, dismissed as rumors or confused sightings of regular Shermans. When the jumbo tanks began appearing on the front lines, German intelligence dismissed them as mere anomalies, just more of the same. No one thought to investigate further, no one understood the new threat they were facing. The idea of an American tank that could withstand their 88mm PaK-43 and keep fighting was simply too far outside their established understanding of the war. It was a blind spot that would cost them dearly. The reliance on outdated intelligence compounded the problem. German officers were still operating under the assumption that American tanks were thinly armored, easily destroyed by the might of the 88mm. The tank crews had long been taught that once they struck their target, it was only a matter of time before it burned or exploded. But the Jumbo Sherman had shattered that assumption. It was not just another tank, it was a psychological weapon, one that made their prized 88mm guns seem unreliable and their intelligence seem outdated. And by the time they realized the full extent of the threat, it was too late to adapt. The real test for the Jumbo came when it faced German heavy tanks. Could it survive the firepower of the legendary Tiger and Panther tanks? Or would it meet its match? The answer would not come easily, for while the Jumbo's armor made it nearly impervious to smaller weapons, it still faced the heavy firepower of Germany's most formidable tanks, machines built for one purpose, to destroy anything in their path. The Jumbo, for all its strength, had its limitations. Its 75mm gun, though effective against infantry and lighter armor, was inferior to the long-barreled 75mm on the Panther or the 88mm on the Tiger. In a direct confrontation with these tanks, the Jumbo was outgunned. The crews knew this. The Americans didn't have the luxury of superior firepower. They had armor, and that armor at least could give them a fighting chance. When the Jumbo encountered the Tiger or the Panther, it became a battle of endurance. The German tanks were far more powerful, capable of delivering devastating blows from over 1,000 meters. But the Jumbo's thick armor, reinforced and hardened, could absorb those blows, shrugging off direct hits that would have destroyed a standard Sherman. The American tank crews, who had once feared the German heavy tanks, now felt a new sense of confidence. They knew they could take the hits. The question was whether they could return fire fast enough to do any real damage. But the Jumbo's vulnerability lay not in its front armor, which could withstand the heaviest blows, but in its sides and rear. The thick plating protected the crew from the immediate threat of fire, but a well-placed shot to the vulnerable sides or rear could still spell disaster. The German Panthers and Tigers knew this, and they exploited every opportunity to flank the Jumbos, firing at angles where the armor was thinner. The American crews, too, understood this risk. They had to be cautious, constantly on the move, using the terrain to protect their flanks. The battle between the Sherman's armor and German firepower became a test of tactical ingenuity rather than brute force. The American tank crews had learned that the key to surviving wasn't just about standing and fighting. It was about making sure they never gave the Germans the opportunity to land a clean shot. They used speed, cover, and their own experience to stay alive, outflanking the Germans when they could and always keeping their tanks in motion. The Germans, meanwhile, had to deal with a growing realization. The Sherman, once a tank that could be destroyed with ease, was now able to absorb their best shots. The psychological toll on the German crews was immense. The 88mm, the weapon they had relied on for so long, no longer guaranteed success. The psychological impact of facing the Jumbo was profound, for it challenged everything they had been taught. The certainty of their superiority was gone, replaced by a creeping doubt. And as long as the Jumbo kept rolling forward, that doubt would continue to eat away at them, undermining their confidence with every failed shot. For the American crews, the Jumbo became more than just a tank. It was a symbol of survival, a testament to the resilience of the Allied forces. Despite its limitations, despite the slow, methodical pace of its movements, the Jumbo proved that the Allies had something to stand against the Germans' most powerful tanks. The battle for control was no longer about who had the superior firepower. It was about who could adapt, who could endure. And in that, the Jumbo had already won. It wasn't just the armor that changed the course of the war. It was the mere presence of the Jumbo. German forces began to hesitate, questioning everything they thought they knew about American tanks. For the better part of 3 years, the Germans had viewed Allied armor as inferior, a speed bump on the path to victory. Their 88mm gun, renowned for its power, had made sure of that. But now, on the battlefield in the frozen woods of Belgium, they were facing something different. Something they couldn't kill with their trusted weapon. The psychological effect the Jumbo had on German soldiers was profound. Tank crews who had once approached combat with a near-military certainty now found themselves gripped by doubt. When their first 88mm shell bounced off the Sherman's thick armor, it was as if the ground had shifted beneath their feet. The gun that had always been a guarantee of destruction was suddenly unreliable. With every failed shot, the Germans' confidence eroded, replaced by an uneasy sense of confusion. For the first time in years, German soldiers were forced to question their assumptions. The Sherman had always been an easy target, a tank that could be defeated with precision and power. But now, with the appearance of the Jumbo, they faced an unexpected force that couldn't be so easily dismissed. The more the German tank crews encountered Jumbos in battle, the more they realized that something had changed, and they couldn't figure out how to counter it. The mere sight of the Jumbo on the battlefield had a paralyzing effect. German commanders, already stretched thin by the demands of the war, found themselves forced to rethink their entire strategy. The presence of the Jumbo meant that standard tactics, hitting targets from a distance, outflanking, attacking with overwhelming firepower, no longer worked. The Sherman, once an afterthought, now stood as a formidable challenge. It couldn't be outgunned. It couldn't be destroyed from the front. And German soldiers, who had once relied on certainty, were now faced with uncertainty at every turn. The Germans struggled to adapt, but their inability to recognize the full scope of the threat only deepened the psychological impact. The feeling of being outmatched, of having a weapon that had once been the fear of every Allied soldier now rendered ineffective, was unnerving. For the first time, the Germans weren't just fighting tanks. They were fighting a symbol of America's industrial might, one that could survive the worst the Germans could throw at it and still keep going. The Jumbo Sherman wasn't the tank that won the war, but it was the tank that proved America could stand toe-to-toe with the best that the Germans had to offer, and win. As the war entered its final stages in 1945, the Jumbo's role in the conflict was not marked by grand victories or decisive battles. It was the subtle, persistent presence of these tanks on the battlefield that made a lasting impact. They were symbols not just of tactical innovation, but of the industrial power that the Allies had brought to bear. The very fact that America could produce a tank capable of withstanding the ferocity of the German heavy armor, and do so in numbers small enough to change the course of battles, was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of American forces. The final combat of the Jumbo in 1945, particularly in the last months of the war, reflected the changing tide in Europe. As German forces crumbled under the weight of overwhelming Allied superiority, the Jumbo continued to perform its designed role, leading the charge, absorbing hits, and holding the line. It wasn't just about firepower or tactics anymore. The Germans, already reeling from their industrial and strategic collapse, had to contend with the reality that their enemies had something they couldn't defeat with brute strength alone. In the closing days of the war, as American forces pushed into southern Germany, the Jumbo's effectiveness in battle became almost symbolic. It represented the shift from German dominance to Allied supremacy, showing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the industrial might and innovation of the United States could hold its own. The Jumbos weren't the heroes of the war, but they were the foundation upon which the new American military superiority was built. After the war ended, the influence of the Jumbo stretched far beyond the battlefield. The lessons learned from its design, emphasizing armor over speed, durability over firepower, shaped the development of post-war tank designs and military doctrine. The M26 Pershing, a more heavily armed American tank, owed much of its development to the lessons gleaned from the Jumbo. The approach of balancing protection, firepower, and mobility would become the cornerstone of future tank design. For the soldiers who fought in the Jumbo, its legacy was more personal. Veterans who had crept into battle inside these steel monsters carried the knowledge that they had survived not by luck, but by the sheer power of American engineering. They didn't just go home with a sense of accomplishment. They carried with them a sense of pride that their survival had been earned through innovation, not chance. The German soldiers who had faced the Jumbo also carried memories that would last a lifetime. The psychological toll of seeing their powerful 88mm guns fail time after time lingered long after the war ended. It wasn't just the loss of the war that haunted them, it was the loss of certainty. The belief in their own superiority had been shattered, and that was harder to accept than any battlefield defeat. Many would question their own competence, wondering if they had missed something or failed to adapt in time. But the truth was more unsettling. They had been facing something they simply hadn't been prepared for, something that the sheer might of their war machine couldn't crush. The legacy of the Jumbo Sherman, though small in the grand scheme of the war, proved a crucial turning point. It wasn't the tank that won the war, but it was the tank that embodied America's ability to innovate and adapt, and that, in the end, was the key to victory.